Astrological houses are so difficult to interpret because there is a lot of misinformation on the internet, but I have the correct information and I'm going to share it with you. Rule number 1, the chart is a wheel. It is also a clock and it begins with a point called the ascendant. The ascendant or rising sign is in the eastern portion of the chart, always falling in the first house. It represents the rising sun and conveys themes of illumination, visibility, and birth. The first house will be your foundation for understanding the rest of the houses because they will relate positively, negatively, or critically to the ascendant point. We are going to start the series with the 7th house opposite the first house. If the first house is birth, the 7th house is endings. If the first house is self, the 7th house is others. If the first house is sunrise, the 7th house is sunset. The 7th house is known as the house of cooperation because of its association to others, and it can represent your first marriage, serious relationships, or business arrangements. So if you have the sun in the 7th house, does that make you a cooperative person? No, it actually produces the opposite results. The sun is about authority and sovereignty, and you're placing it in an area where it needs to compromise. So the sun in the 7th house, depending on the sign that it's in, might indicate that you are very familiar and good at handling conflict, so you make a good lawyer, for example. Or you're someone who gets into constant arguments, fights with people, or that you've been given a very good and just reason to rebel against something that was compromising your boundaries. A lesser known fact about the 7th house is that it is associated with travel. Why? Because it is the house of the sunset. From day to night is a transition, it's a change. So if you have a lot of planets in the 7th house, it could mean that it is very difficult for you to find stability, or maybe that you don't crave stability at all, that you want there to be a lot of rhythm and movement. It could indicate a canon life event associated with a big move or a big transition. And because the 7th house is the house of endings, if you have a planet transiting there, it might mean that that year is about you parting ways with something. The 8th house is right above the 7th house and makes an inconjunct relationship to the 1st house. An inconjunction, to put simply, is a 150-degree angle. And 150-degree angles are very awkward in astrology. The 8th house is called an active house precisely because of its awkward relationship to the 1st. If the 1st is about brightness and illumination, and the 8th house cannot entirely connect to that, then it's going to signify a loss of light or a loss of life. So when we find a planet in the 8th house, it's losing its power and starting to behave more unpredictably. Although people call the 8th house a very intense house, it isn't inherently about intensity. The 8th house is about loss. And loss is something that we cannot control. Death is something we cannot control, so death becomes an intense topic. But if we listen to people who have had near-death experiences, death is not so intense. It's actually quite peaceful, maybe even euphoric. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not about intensity per se. It's about how being out of control makes us feel. The 8th house can also be understood in its opposition to the 2nd house. The 2nd house is directly below the 1st, indicating everything that supports us, including our income. If the 8th house is opposing the 2nd, it deals with money as well, but in a less direct manner. It represents our inheritances and our ability to attract money by not having to put out much effort. Again, the 8th house is inactive, so this isn't really about being very ambitious. If the 2nd house is about having everything and the 8th house is about having not so much, 8th house people have to learn how to ask for help. Having planets in the 8th house can make us more shy, internal, not very trusting of others. We just generally move much slower. The 9th house makes a trine to the 1st house, and to put simply, a trine is a 120-degree relationship, and a 120-degree relationship is a harmonious and blessed one. So if the 1st house is about illumination and expression of self, the 9th house is going to be supportive of that. The 9th house is the house of morals, ethics, authority, and institutions. It is also about parents, which people don't really associate the 9th house with. Everyone associates the 4th house with parents, and it's both. So if you want to understand what role your parents play in your life, look for planets in the 9th house. The 9th house is called the house of God. It's about higher knowledge, the higher self, education, and pilgrimage. Travel and education typically requires someone to have a certain degree of freedom or liberty in life. So the 9th house could indicate someone who has privilege or is free to do as they please. The 9th house is a philosopher who attempts to answer the question of his origin. It's a house associated with governments and society. So it's pro-social. It's not introverted. But more importantly, the ninth house is about having confidence. It's about being optimistic. So planets in the ninth house can indicate how much or how little faith in yourself you have.